Remember, I told you that basically through Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 11, God is dealing with the nations at large. But then in chapter 12, he turns from dealing with the nations to dealing with an individual, Abraham, of whom he will make a great nation. God begins to call out individuals, and he begins to commission them with a royal priesthood. This commission of Genesis 1:27 and 8 and this priesthood of Genesis 2:15 is then passed on to these individuals that God calls out, and Scripture is clear that God intends for these individuals to bear His glory to the nations, to become glory bearers and to carry His glory and His worship and His salvation to the darkened nations that have rebelled against Him. Before we start looking at specific patriarchs, I want us to go back and review some of the characteristics of the Adamic priesthood and the commission that God gave Adam there in the garden. First of all, we will see, or we've already seen, that all of this takes place in a temple setting. We saw all of the features of the Garden of Eden that were typical of temples throughout the Old Testament. Secondly, we see that God blesses them. God blessed them in Genesis 1:27. God blesses His creation, Adam and Eve, and then He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. Here's your expansion mandate. God did not create, according to Isaiah chapter 45, God did not create the world empty, but He created it to be what? Inhabited, correct? Then we see that God tells them to fill the earth. Then God tells them to subdue the earth. All of this from Genesis 1:27-28. And then He tells them to have dominion in the earth. And again, the idea of subduing the earth is that as a king priest, Adam was to bring the earth in subjection to the Creator. He was to maintain the order and guard the sanctity of the worship of God and the commands of God there in the garden. And he was to teach the holy commandments of God to his progeny, to his offspring, so that they in turn would produce other king priests to be God's image bearers in the earth. Of course, as we well know, Adam utterly failed. He rebelled against God and ceded his kingly priestly position there in the Edenic temple and forfeited everything that God had charged him with. As we move through the narrative of Genesis, the next Adam-like figure that we see is Noah. And I want to look at this concept of the priestly, kingly role taking place in a temple setting. And I want us to filter some passages about Noah through that and see what we find. You remember the story of Noah. He built the ark, the flood came, everybody was destroyed except the 8 souls that were in the ark. And as the waters began to recede off of the earth, the ark came to rest where? On a what? Mountain. Okay? And as this ark came to rest on this mountain, Noah exits the ark and he builds an altar. And he offers a sacrifice to God of clean animals. And Scripture tells us, if you look at Genesis, I believe it's the latter 3 or 4 verses of chapter 9, or rather chapter 8, Scripture tells us that as Noah offered these sacrifices, the smell of that rose up before God, the aroma of it rose up before God and became a pleasing aroma to Him. Where do we hear that language used elsewhere in the Old Testament? In the tabernacle and the temple offerings. Nowhere else do you hear the idea of this sweet-smelling, pleasing aroma to God. So think about what's taking place here. Noah's on a mountain. He builds an altar. He offers sacrifices. And God smells a sweet-smelling aroma. That's a temple setting. That's a miniature temple, if you will. And then I want you to look what God says to Noah immediately on the heels of this temple act of worship in Genesis chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Do you hear the familiar language there? This is a repetition. This is a repetition of the mandate that God, the blessing and the mandate that God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden, is it not? And if you go on, and we don't have time to go through this, you can do this for yourself, but if you go on and you read the narrative of Genesis chapter 9, you find that God, just as God gave Adam commandments in the garden, God gives Noah commandments, and that these commandments, that the entire earth is to be subjected to these commandments. And there's the implication that Noah and his sons should tread down that which would exalt itself against the commands and the laws of the Creator. Of course, we know that Noah fails in this. In the stupor of drunkenness, he, like Adam, forfeits all that God has commanded him to do, all the blessing that God has given to him. Noah fails just as Adam fails. But then God raises up a man named Abraham from the line of Shem, who was the son of Noah. God raises up Abraham. We're all familiar with the story of Abraham, and we see God come to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, beginning with verse 1, and he says, now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. God calls him out of Ur of the Chaldees, tells him to leave that place where his family is at, and tells him to go to a country that he's going to show him. God is calling Abraham out, I believe, as a priest king, and he is giving him a mandate to expand upon that. If we skip forward to Genesis chapter 22, remember the major thing that took place in Genesis chapter 22? Who can tell me? Sacrifice of Isaac. Very good. Okay? God comes to Abraham, tells him, I want you to take your son, your only son Isaac, take him to a mountain that I'm going to show you, and there I want you to offer him to me as a sacrifice. And as we know, reading the narrative now, we understand that this was a test of Abraham's faith in God. But I want you to look and think about what's taking place in Genesis chapter 22. Where does God tell him to take Isaac to make a sacrifice? You got your mountain again there. Exactly. So he goes to offer a sacrifice. He goes to a mountain that God shows him. This mountain in the land of Moriah. He builds what? An altar. And he lays Isaac upon that wood to sacrifice him. Here again, you have the clear semblances of a temple setting. This is a miniature temple, if you will. And as Dan was saying, interestingly enough, it is believed that Abraham's site, the site where Abraham was going to offer Isaac, is the very site on which the Solomonic temple was eventually built. 2 Chronicles, I can't remember the exact chapter, tells us that Solomon built the temple on Mount what? Moriah. So you have your temple setting there. But I want you to look at Genesis chapter 22, beginning with verse 17. God says to Abraham, I will surely bless you. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. Do you see the blessing? You see the multiplying? These are the same concepts that we find in Genesis chapter 1. This is almost an